She crossed the desert with a baby in her womb and a dream in her heart. But when she arrived seeking hope, they handcuffed her, locked her up, and forced her to give birth behind cold bars and indifferent stares. Separated from her own child, not knowing if she would ever see him again, Maria Fernanda fought against the impossible. And what she did next would move the entire world. Maria Fernanda clutched the frayed strap of her backpack tightly as the bus rattled along the dirt road. She was barely 24, but her eyes already carried the resignation of someone who had seen too much. Her belly, round and taut, revealed the 8 months of pregnancy she carried. Each curve in the road seemed to stir not only her exhausted body, but also the painful memories she was leaving behind in the Guatemala that had seen her birth. If you enjoy interesting stories, hit like, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Her home, a small, unpainted block construction on the outskirts of Chiquimula, was now forbidden territory. The threat had come with a stray bullet in her grandmother's gate, a silent warning from the cartel that controlled the area. Maria knew how to read the signs. Staying meant condemning her son, Diego, to a future of fear, extortion, and death, and that was something she would never allow. There was no money for visas or legal permits. There was only hope. And hope, when it's all you have, can move mountains or cross deserts. She sold what little she had: a pair of inherited earrings, the old television, and some clothes that barely fit her anymore. With that, she paid a coyote, a man with an impassive face who barely promised to leave her near the border. She didn't ask more. Asking meant risking hearing answers she didn't want to face. The dawn when she left, her mother hugged her with a force that almost broke her. "Take care of that child," she whispered in her ear, through tears that Maria decided not to answer. If she spoke, she would break. If she cried, she might not be able to leave, and giving up wasn't an option. The journey north was a nightmare of dust, heat, and fear. At every military checkpoint, at every improvised stop, Maria felt her heart beating so hard it would betray her presence. Her feet, swollen and painful, barely supported the weight of her pregnancy and fear. She ate what she could, almost nothing, and drank rationed water that tasted of earth and hopelessness. In her mind, she repeated over and over the image of Diego, a boy with dark hair and bright eyes, running free under a wide, clean sky, without the echo of gunshots or the whistle of threats. It was this vision that kept her standing when her entire body begged to surrender. As they advanced toward the border, the group she traveled with grew smaller. Some were captured, others simply disappeared in the middle of the night. Each loss was a brutal reminder of what was at stake. Maria wrapped herself in her worn sweater each night, not to protect herself from the cold, which was unbearable, but to hide her pregnancy as much as she could. She knew that for many coyotes, a lone, vulnerable woman was just another commodity that could be sold. When the coyote finally announced they should prepare to cross the desert, Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dawn wind. The journey would be on foot during the night, carrying her backpack, her fear, and the life growing inside her. Before entering the vast nothingness of the Sonoran desert, Maria crouched down, placed a hand on her belly, and whispered softly, "Hang in there, my love. We're almost there." There was no turning back, only forward, only the dream, only the promise of a freedom she had never known, but was determined to give Diego, whatever the cost. The first night was brutal. The day's heat transformed into a cutting cold that chilled to the bone. The sandy ground seemed to suck at her cheap boots with every step. The contractions, mild but persistent, began to manifest as deep stabs at the base of her back. Maria gritted her teeth and kept walking, refusing to give in. The guide hurried them along with rough gestures and words she barely understood through the wind's murmur. Every so often, the distant howl of a real coyote, the animal this time, could be heard, a ghostly lament echoing in the vastness of the night. Dawn broke, and the heat began to strike with brutal force. There was no shade, no shelter, just miles and miles of sand and stones. Maria felt her skin cracking under the merciless sun. Her lips were bleeding. Her throat was a dry cavern. Each step brought her closer to the border, but also pushed her to the edge of collapse. At one point, she could go no further. She fell to her knees in the burning sand, feeling how salty tears mixed with dust. The group continued on. Only a boy of about 16, with a frightened look, stopped to offer her his half-empty canteen. Maria took a sip and, with superhuman effort, stood up again. "I'm not going to die here," she told herself aloud, as if she could convince her body with words alone. "You won't either, Diego." The desert shows no mercy. Every minute was a test, every breath a battle, and Maria Fernanda, with her broken heart and heavy womb, was determined to win. Maria Fernanda walked with faltering steps, fighting against exhaustion that had ceased to be physical and become mental torture. Each stride in that burning desert was like dragging invisible chains. The young man who had helped her, named Julian, remained by her side, occasionally giving her concerned looks, as if he knew she might fall at any moment, never to rise again. The sun gave no respite. It was a merciless enemy, draining their life sip by sip. Maria felt her skin cracking, her muscles dissolving, her will faltering. But then, whenever pain threatened to break her, she remembered Diego's face in her imagination. Small, smiling without fear, waiting for her somewhere in the future. It was that, and only that, which kept her moving. In the distance, the coyote guiding them raised a hand, indicating they should stop. The group, now reduced to about 8 people, collapsed on the sand, panting like wounded animals. Maria dropped to her knees, feeling a contraction pierce her like lightning. She bit her arm to keep from screaming. She mustn't alert anyone, not now. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the pain that spread from her womb like liquid fire. "Are you okay?" whispered Julian, crouching beside her. Maria barely nodded, unable to speak. The young man looked at her with a mixture of terror and compassion. Both knew she wasn't okay. Both knew that giving birth in the middle of the desert would be a death sentence. The coyote approached, his face hard and without a gram of compassion in his eyes. "If you can't continue, you stay," he growled, not bothering to lower his voice. Maria looked at him, swallowing her tears. She couldn't stay. She couldn't die there. She couldn't lose Diego before meeting him. "I'll keep going," she managed to say in a thin voice. The man let out a dry laugh and kept walking. The group rose as best they could and moved forward, a procession of specters fighting to survive. The hours stretched like days. The water was gone. Maria's legs were 2 empty columns about to break. Each step was a prayer, each breath an ordeal. When the sun began to descend on the horizon, tinting the sky an agonizing orange, Maria fell again, this time face first in the sand. The contraction that shook her was stronger, deeper, as if her body decided, regardless of her will, that the time had come. She couldn't get up. Not this time. "No, no, no," she moaned, feeling fear crawling up her back like a swarm of insects. Julian crouched beside her, pale with horror. "She's having the baby," he shouted, but the group was already moving away, their silhouettes disappearing in the distance without looking back. The coyote didn't stop. For him, a pregnant woman wasn't a priority. She was just another hindrance in a dirty business. Maria gasped, digging her fingers into the sand, feeling her body go into labor. Night began to fall, and with it, a murderous cold that filtered under her tattered clothes. Julian, trembling, looked around. There was no shelter, no help, just desert, wind, and death. "I don't know what to do," he stammered, desperate. "Help me." begged Maria, her face a mask of pain and terror. The young man, moved by an instinct he himself didn't understand, took off his jacket and spread it on the sand for her to lie down. He searched among his few belongings and found a bottle with a couple of drops of water that he offered to Maria, who drank eagerly. The contractions were getting stronger, more frequent. Maria felt the world reducing to that monstrous pain, to that endless instant in which she struggled to bring Diego into a world that at that moment seemed to want to expel them both. The birth began in the middle of the desert, under a sky filled with indifferent stars. Maria screamed, biting her lips until they bled, while Julian, not knowing what to do, encouraged her with clumsy words of support. "You can do it, Maria. Almost there, almost there." The cold enveloped her. The pain tore her apart, but the life inside her was fighting too. She wasn't alone, not completely. Finally, after one last effort that drew a heart-rending scream from her throat, Maria felt the weight in her womb lighten. A baby's cry broke the brutal silence of the night. Julian, with trembling hands and tears in his eyes, wrapped the little one in his own shirt. He was tiny, wrinkled, but alive. "It's a boy," he whispered, hardly believing it. Maria, exhausted, extended her arms. Julian placed the baby on her chest, and she hugged him with desperate tenderness, as if her warmth could protect him from all the brutality of the world. But there was no time to celebrate. In the distance, on the dark horizon, lights moved erratically. It wasn't the group. It wasn't the coyotes, it was something worse. Maria, still bleeding, still trembling, looked up at Julian, who stared at her with terror. "We have to move," he said, his voice breaking. Maria, with her son in her arms, nodded. There was no option, no respite. In the desert, every second was a battle, and hers was just beginning. The icy wind struck the faces of Maria Fernanda and Julian as they moved clumsily among the dunes. Diego's weak cry broke the silence of the night like a lament. Maria hugged him with all the strength she had left, covering him with her own body, trying to protect him from the murderous cold that was already numbing her fingers. Each step was agony. Her pants were soaked with blood, her legs barely responded, and she felt an incipient fever rising up her back. Julian went ahead, illuminating the path with the dim light of his almost batteryless cell phone, desperately searching for some reference, some miracle hidden in the darkness. Behind, those threatening lights kept moving, slowly approaching. There was no doubt they were being followed. "Hurry, Maria!" Julian begged again and again, but she could no longer run. She barely walked, staggering like a ghost. The desert, scorching by day, now became a frost-covered hell. Little Diego cried more and more weakly, as if the cold were beginning to extinguish his tiny life. Maria felt panic climbing up her chest. Her son could not die there, not after all they had been through. A few meters away, Julian shouted, "There, I see something!" Maria looked up and barely made out a silhouette in the darkness. An old structure, with walls eaten away by time, perhaps an abandoned old watchtower. She didn't think twice. She held onto her baby and moved forward, drawing strength from a place she didn't even know existed. They reached the rickety door, hanging by a single nail. Julian pushed it, and they entered. Inside, the air smelled of rotten wood and dried urine, but at least it protected them from the deadly wind. There were no windows, just a small opening in one of the walls. Julian, without thinking, searched among the scattered trash and found a piece of dirty canvas that he used to cover them. Maria sat on the floor, trembling, cradling Diego against her chest. The little one kept crying, but his cry was barely a whisper. "He needs warmth," she murmured, feeling desperation tearing her apart inside. Julian took off the jacket he was still wearing and placed it around Maria and the baby, pressing them against his thin, young body. "You need to sleep a little," he told her, though he knew that in those conditions, sleeping was a mortal risk. Maria shook her head. She couldn't close her eyes, not when danger was so close, not when her son was so vulnerable. A few minutes passed, or perhaps hours, it was impossible to know, until Julian looked out through the small opening again. "I don't see them anymore," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean they're gone." Maria barely heard him. The fever was consuming her. She saw dark spots dancing before her eyes. The weakness was absolute, but her mind, her heart, had only one concern: Diego. Suddenly they heard footsteps, several, heavy, determined. Julian ran to the door and secured it as best he could, blocking it with a plank he found in a corner. Then he approached Maria, standing in front of her, as if his fragile adolescent body could protect them. The door vibrated under a violent blow. "Open up, damn it! We know you're in there!" shouted a deep voice full of hatred. Maria hugged Diego with all her might, closing her eyes, silently praying for a miracle she didn't believe she deserved. Another blow shook the door. The wood creaked. It wouldn't hold much longer. Julian desperately looked for something to defend himself with, finding only a rusty bar among the trash. He held it with both hands, trembling, determined to fight even though he knew he had no chance. The door received a third blow. This time the plank broke in two. Then, as if from nowhere, gunshots were heard, several, close. Voices shouted in Spanish mixed with English. "Border Patrol, get them on the ground!" The attackers, surprised, fled in a stampede into the darkness. Julian stood petrified, not understanding what was happening. Maria could barely open her eyes, but in her numbed mind she understood. It was the Border Patrol. Minutes later, two armed agents burst into the shed, illuminating with powerful flashlights. "Ma'am, calm down! We're here to help!" one of them shouted, approaching slowly. Maria tried to respond, but her body no longer obeyed her. Her whole world turned black. She woke up hours later, in a hard bed of an improvised hospital. Everything around her was white and grey. Tubes, monitors, the penetrating smell of disinfectant. She tried to move, but a sharp pain stopped her. "Take it easy. Don't strain yourself," said a kind-faced nurse in Spanish. "My baby?" she managed to ask in a raspy voice. The nurse smiled, a small but sincere smile. "He's fine. He's strong, just like his mum." Maria closed her eyes, feeling a warm tear roll down her dirty cheek. Against all odds, they had survived. She didn't know what awaited them now: deportation, detention, separation. The system was cruel, and she knew it. But at that moment, all that mattered was that Diego was alive. And as long as she had her son in her arms, she would find the strength to face it all. In the darkness of the improvised hospital, Maria Fernanda promised, with all her torn and hopeful heart, that she would never give up again. Never. The white walls of the improvised hospital seemed to close in around Maria Fernanda as she waited, alone, on a rusty stretcher. Diego slept in a portable crib next to her, covered with a worn blue blanket. Despite the exhaustion consuming her, she couldn't take her eyes off her son. She feared that if she blinked, everything would disappear, as if this small triumph were just a dream the desert had stolen from her. The sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway made her sit up with difficulty. Julian appeared in the doorway, accompanied by an immigration agent dressed in olive green uniform. The boy wore an expression of relief and weariness that broke your heart. "How are you?" Julian asked quietly, quickly approaching. Maria tried to smile, but only managed a weak movement of her lips. She had no strength for more. She just raised a hand, seeking his. Julian took it gently. "They told us they're going to transfer us," he added, lowering his voice, "to a detention center." Maria's heart stopped for a moment. A detention center, that meant metal cages, constant cold, rationed food, and, worst of all, separation from her son. She had heard it too many times in the stories of other migrants. Mothers separated from their babies, children crying alone in cages. She felt panic taking hold of her chest, but Diego, as if sensing her fear, stirred in his crib and let out a small whimper. Maria took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay strong. She couldn't break down now. The agent, a man with a tired but not cruel face, came a little closer. "Ma'am, I understand you're weak, but we need to move," he said in clumsy but understandable Spanish. "Transport is ready outside." Maria nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Julian helped carry her few belongings, which barely consisted of a broken backpack and the shirt Diego had been wrapped in at birth. They took her in a wheelchair to a white van, where other migrants waited dejectedly. Mothers with children, lone men, teenagers, all with the same look, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and resignation. The vehicle started, and the arid landscape began to move slowly past the dirty windows. Maria hugged Diego, who slept deeply, oblivious to the hostile world surrounding them. During the journey, Julian sat next to her in silence. There weren't enough words to describe what they felt. The exhaustion was absolute, but so was the uncertainty. After almost 2 hours of driving, they arrived at a building surrounded by wire fences. It was even worse than Maria had imagined. The detention center was a cold, depersonalized place where people moved like shadows under the constant surveillance of armed agents. A uniformed woman approached and, in a monotonous voice, began giving orders. Mothers and children on one side, single men on the other. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Julian, terrified. "No," she whispered. "Please don't separate us." The young man, who had been her only support in the desert hell, smiled sadly. "You'll be okay," he told her, squeezing her hand one last time before being led down another corridor. Maria, with Diego in her arms, was taken to a different area. It was a huge room enclosed with bars, illuminated by fluorescent lights. The floor was covered with silver thermal blankets that crackled with every movement. There were dozens of women, some asleep, others simply sitting, hugging their children with the same desperation she felt. They assigned her a space in a corner where she settled as best she could. Diego continued sleeping, oblivious to the nightmare surrounding them. Time inside the detention center was a non-existent concept. They didn't know if it was day or night. There were only endless lines to receive a tray of bland food, superficial medical checks, and quick interviews with officials who showed no empathy. In one of those interrogations, Maria was taken to a small room where a blonde woman with a severe expression received her behind a metal desk. "Full name?" she asked in automatic Spanish. "Maria Fernanda Lopez Castillo," she replied in a trembling voice. "Country of origin, Guatemala. Reason for your illegal entry?" Maria hesitated. What could she say? That she was fleeing violence, death, an inevitable fate for her son. That fear had pushed her beyond her own limits. That she just wanted to live. "I'm seeking protection," she finally whispered. The woman nodded, taking notes without looking up. "You'll have a hearing. Meanwhile, you'll remain detained." That was it. There was no comfort, no promises, just a meanwhile that could last weeks or months. She returned to the common area, hugging Diego more tightly than ever. The baby cried, uncomfortable from the constant cold and hostile environment. Maria sang him a song her mother had taught her as a child, trying to calm him, trying to calm herself. Night, if it could be called that, fell on them again. The light never went out. But the exhaustion was so deep that Maria closed her eyes, gently rocking with Diego in her arms, promising herself once more that no matter what came, she wouldn't give up. Because now, more than ever, she understood that resisting wasn't just an option. It was the only way to survive. The days in the detention center blurred, repeating in a monotonous and painful routine that seemed endless. Maria Fernanda, with Diego always in her arms, barely touched the bland food they distributed. Her only priority was keeping her son fed and warm in that cold hell of permanent lights and exhausted faces. The other women shared stories in whispers, as if they feared even the walls could punish them for having hope. Some had crossed the border fleeing gangs, others extreme poverty. All carried in their eyes the same pain, the same tiredness that Maria saw every time she looked at herself in a dirty reflection on the metal walls. One night, or something that seemed like night, while trying to sleep curled up in a corner, she felt a hand gently touch her shoulder. It was an older woman with a wrinkled face and a sweet gaze. "Hey girl," she whispered, "I heard you mentioned you're seeking asylum." Maria nodded, unsure. "You have to ask for a credible fear interview," said the woman. "It's the only way to avoid being deported immediately." Maria barely understood what that meant, but she clung to this new hope like a lifeline. She promised herself she would do everything possible. She hadn't come this far to be sent back to a place where she would die before Diego learned to walk. The next morning, she approached one of the agents and, with a trembling voice, asked for a credible fear interview. The man looked at her without emotion and barely nodded. "They'll put you on the list," he said, as if that were enough. More eternal days passed before they finally called her. They took her to a small room where an interpreter and an immigration officer waited. Maria felt her legs turn to jelly as she sat down. Diego whimpered weakly on her chest. The officer began the interrogation, asking quick, sharp questions, as if each second they spent with her was a waste. "Why do you fear returning to your country?" Maria swallowed. Her dry lips trembled. "They threatened me," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "They killed the girls in my neighborhood if they didn't do what they wanted. They controlled everything. I couldn't protect my son there." The officer kept writing without looking up. He made no sign that he believed or cared about what she said. "Do you have evidence?" The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. Evidence? What evidence could a woman who fled at dawn with only the clothes on her back have? "No," she admitted with eyes full of tears. "Just my word." The officer sighed and continued with his protocol. Maria felt that each answer she gave was like digging her own grave. When they finished, they left her alone in the room, hugging Diego, while silent tears rolled down her face. She understood that her future, and her son's, depended on those few words she had said, on the coldness of a system that saw no people, only files. She returned to her space among the thermal blankets, where Julian was waiting for her. He had also had his interview, but he didn't want to tell her how it went. It was enough to see the sadness in his eyes to know it hadn't gone well. The following days were worse. The atmosphere inside the center became tenser as the rejections began to arrive. Mass deportations, mothers torn from their children, screams, crying. Maria lived with her heart in her throat every time an agent shouted a name. One afternoon, when she already thought her fate was sealed, an officer approached her. "Lopez Castillo, Maria Fernanda," he announced. Maria jumped up, holding Diego tightly. "Yes, you have to come with me." He took her to a small office where a woman in a gray suit was waiting. She was different from the other officials. This woman looked her straight in the eyes. "I'm your court-appointed lawyer," she said in clear Spanish. "I received your case. I've been assigned to help you." Maria could hardly believe it. "Lawyer? Me?" "Yes. There's a possibility you can get a temporary permit," the woman explained, showing her papers. "But you must tell me your entire story in detail, without omitting anything." Maria nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her chest. For hours, she recounted every moment of terror lived in Guatemala. She spoke of the threats, the fear, the infernal journey, the birth in the desert. The lawyer took quick notes, sometimes stopping to ask her specific questions. "Your story is strong, Maria," the woman said at the end. "But we need evidence, witnesses, complaints, anything that supports your fear." Maria felt a stab in her heart. How was she going to get evidence from that confinement? The lawyer seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm going to do what I can," she promised. "Not all is lost." When she returned to the detention hall, Julian ran to meet her. Maria told him what had happened, trying to contain her excitement, but Julian just nodded with a sad smile. "They told me I'm being deported tomorrow," he confessed. Maria's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "No, they can't do that. I don't have family here or a child like you," he said, shrugging. "You must fight. For Diego." Maria hugged him tightly. She didn't know how to thank him for everything he had done for her. That night they stayed awake, speaking in whispers, as if by sharing their fears they could lighten the weight of their hearts. When dawn, or what seemed to be dawn, came, Julian was taken away. They didn't say goodbye with words, just a long look full of gratitude and pain. Maria, hugging Diego, promised herself that no matter how many doors she had to knock on, she would not let her son grow up in fear. The battle was just beginning. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. Julian's absence left a silent void in Maria Fernanda's heart. Every time she looked at the corner where he used to sleep, a bitter stab went through her. She didn't know what would become of him, or if she would ever see him again, but she couldn't allow herself to fall into sadness. Diego, fragile and innocent, depended completely on her. The lawyer returned 2 days later with a grave but determined face. "We have an opportunity," she told her, sitting across from her in the small space between the thermal blankets. Maria looked at her with eyes full of hope. "Really? I've managed to contact a shelter in Arizona," the woman explained. "If they accept your preliminary asylum application, they can release you into the custody of this shelter while your case is processed." Maria nodded quickly. It didn't matter where, it didn't matter how. She just needed to get out of that place before something worse happened. "What do I have to do?" she asked. "You must testify again before an immigration judge," said the lawyer. "It's your last chance." Fear squeezed her stomach, but she forced herself to nod. For Diego. For the future she had promised to build. The day of the hearing arrived faster than she imagined. They took her in handcuffs on wrists and ankles, as if she were a criminal. Holding Diego in her arms, she entered the room where a judge with a severe face and tired eyes awaited her, along with an official translator. Her lawyer gave her a slight pat on the back before starting. During the hearing, Maria recounted her story again, her voice trembling but firm. Each word that came out of her mouth was an open wound, a confession of all the pain she had endured. She spoke of the threats, the murders in her neighborhood, the daily fear, the desperate escape. When she finished, the judge remained silent for a moment that seemed eternal. "The court finds that the applicant has demonstrated credible fear," he finally said. "She will be granted freedom under the custody of a shelter while her asylum application is processed." Maria could barely contain the sob that rose to her throat. It wasn't complete freedom, it wasn't the end of her struggle, but it was a step, a first step. Back at the detention center, she gathered her few belongings. Diego slept on her chest, completely unaware of the revolution taking place in his mother's life. Hours later, a different vehicle picked her up. This time it wasn't an armored truck, but a modest van driven by a woman with gray hair and a kind smile. "Welcome," she said in Spanish as Maria climbed in with effort. The journey to the shelter was long but different. This time she didn't feel the weight of absolute fear. It was fatigue mixed with fragile, trembling hope. They arrived at a simple building, painted white with a small, dried-up garden in front. A sign said, "Casa Nueva Esperanza," New Hope House. Never had a name held so much meaning for her. Inside, women and children moved in an atmosphere of respect and quiet. It wasn't the home Maria had dreamed of, but it was much more than she had had in months. The director of the shelter, a robust woman with a sweet voice named Doña Marta, welcomed her with a warm embrace that disarmed the last defenses Maria had built to survive. "You're safe here, daughter," she whispered. They installed her in a room shared with 2 other mothers. The space was small, with bunk beds and a small wardrobe, but it was clean, warm, and above all, free from threats. For the first time in a long time, Maria was able to bathe in warm water, change into clean clothes, and put Diego in a decent crib. That night, under the thick blankets of the shelter, she cried silently. She cried for the terror she had lived through, for the losses, for Julian, for her mother whom she might never see again. But she also cried with relief, with gratitude. She had come so far, against everything, against everyone. The days at the shelter passed between endless paperwork, English classes, psychological support sessions, and visits from her lawyer. Maria began to recover something she thought lost: her dignity. She worked in the shelter's kitchen in exchange for lodging, while waiting for her final asylum hearing. Every small advance, every smile from Diego, every new word she learned in English was a small victory, but not everything was easy. Every letter that arrived could be a deportation notice. Every call could be a setback. Anxiety never completely abandoned her. One afternoon, while washing dishes in the community kitchen, she heard her name over the shelter's loudspeakers. "Maria Fernanda Lopez Castillo, please report to the office." Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly dried her hands and ran, almost tripping on her way. Doña Marta was waiting at the door, holding a large envelope. "It's for you, daughter," she said, handing it to her. Maria took it with trembling hands. She immediately recognized the logo of the Department of Immigration. She sat down in one of the office chairs and carefully opened the envelope, as if fearing that the mere act of reading its contents could change her fate. She pulled out the papers, read the first lines, and her eyes filled with tears. They had accepted her preliminary application. They were granting her a temporary permit to reside in the United States while her asylum case was processed. It wasn't total victory. It wasn't eternal security, but it was an opportunity, an open door. Maria hugged the papers to her chest and, for the first time since crossing the border, allowed a real smile to illuminate her face. Diego, in her arms, babbled something unintelligible, as if celebrating with her. The battle was not over yet, but now, finally, she had something they couldn't take away: hope. The following days at Casa Nueva Esperanza were tinged with a different energy for Maria Fernanda. The fear was still there, lurking in some corner of her mind, but now it was smaller, more manageable. The temporary permit wasn't a guarantee of future, but it was the first step toward a life that until then had seemed an impossible dream. Doña Marta got her an appointment at a legal support organization for immigrants, where they would review her case in depth. Maria went with Diego in her arms, arriving on time, nervous, with the documents in an old folder she had found at the shelter. The lawyer who received her, a young woman with curly hair named Ana Belén, looked at her with attention, with a warmth that immediately instilled confidence. "Your story is powerful," she said after reviewing the documents, "but the process won't be easy. We need to prepare evidence, letters of recommendation, any proof that you're building a life here." Maria nodded with determination. She would do everything in her power. Ana Belén explained that she needed to demonstrate roots in the community, work, volunteering, social ties. Maria listened carefully, making mental notes of every word. From that day on, every minute became crucial. She started working cleaning houses in the neighborhood where the shelter was located. At first, the days were exhausting. She would get up before dawn to prepare Diego, who stayed in the care of a volunteer at the community daycare, and go out to walk the streets with her backpack over her shoulder. It didn't matter how much her feet hurt at the end of the day, or how heavy the fatigue was. Every dollar she earned not only fed Diego, it was also further proof of her willingness to stay, of her desire to build something better. Besides work, she began attending English classes 3 times a week. At first, the words bounced around in her head without meaning, as if they were pieces of an impossible puzzle. But little by little, one word here, a phrase there, she began to understand. Good morning. Thank you. I need help. Each new word learned was a small personal victory. Maria also got involved in the shelter's activities. She helped organize community dinners, collaborated in general cleaning, cared for other children while their mothers attended legal appointments. Everyone began to know her, respect her, love her. One afternoon, while sweeping the entrance to the shelter, Doña Marta approached her with a proud smile. Daughter, I'm very proud of you. You're proving you deserve this opportunity. Maria lowered her head, embarrassed and moved at the same time. I'm just doing what I have to do. That's exactly what makes the difference, said Doña Marta, affectionately squeezing her shoulder. But despite all the effort, the fear remained latent. Every letter that arrived could be a deportation appointment. Every call could bring bad news. The life of immigrants was walking on a constant tightrope without a safety net. One day, upon returning from work, Maria found an envelope from the immigration department on her bed. Her heart almost stopped. She took a deep breath, caressed Diego's head. He was playing on the floor with a broken toy car, and with trembling hands opened the letter. It was the official notification of her final asylum hearing, date and time, in just 3 weeks. Her stomach churned. It was the moment she had both awaited and feared. All her future, all the sacrifice, all the suffering would be decided in that room. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Diego's peaceful breathing, wondering if it would be enough. Had she done enough? Would the judge be able to see beyond the papers and understand the story in her heart? Ana Belén called her in a few days later to review the strategy. They sat in a small meeting room full of papers and folders. Remember, Ana Belén told her, you must not lie. Tell the truth in your own words. Don't hide your fear. Don't hide your pain. Maria nodded. She didn't need to invent anything. Her life, her journey, were already heartbreaking enough. The lawyer also asked for letters from people who knew her and could speak of her character. Doña Marta, several shelter volunteers, and one of the mothers with whom she shared a room, wrote sincere testimonials, full of gratitude and admiration. The eve of the hearing, Maria spent hours hugging Diego, speaking to him in whispers, as if her words could protect him from everything that was coming. All of this is for you, my love, she murmured, so that you can have a future, so that you never have to go through what I went through. The next morning, she dressed in the best clothes she had, a white blouse she had gotten from a donation, fabric pants, and used but clean shoes. Ana Belén picked her up early, and together they took a taxi to the immigration court. The building was imposing, with cold grey walls. As she got out of the vehicle, Maria felt her legs trembling. Diego, hanging from her arm, seemed to perceive her nervousness as he looked at her with large, serious eyes. Ana Belén put a hand on her back. Whatever happens today, remember, you're already a warrior. Maria took a deep breath, wiped away a treacherous tear rolling down her cheek, and entered the building. It was time to fight for everything, for Diego, for herself, for her right to live without fear. The inside of the immigration court smelled of disinfectant and nervousness. Maria Fernanda slowly advanced down the hallway with Diego in her arms, feeling how each beat of her heart struck against her ribs. Around her, other families waited their turn, tense faces, sweaty hands, eyes that refused to lose hope. Ana Belén walked beside her, checking documents in a folder. She smiled softly. Everything's going to be fine, she whispered, though they both knew there were no guarantees. They arrived at a small hearing room. It was a cold room, with a platform where the judge sat, a desk for the government representative, and 2 chairs for the asylum seekers and their lawyers. Maria sat down, placing Diego on her lap. The child, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, played with the strings of her blouse. The judge, a man with a severe but not cruel face, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the documents in front of him. "Mrs. Lopez Castillo," he began, his deep voice filling the room. "Today we will hear your asylum application. I ask you to answer with the truth. Do you understand?" Maria nodded with a lump in her throat. "Yes, sir." The government representative, a lawyer in a dark suit and impassive expression, looked at her as if she were just another procedure on his endless list. Ana Belén stood up and presented her opening argument, briefly recounting Maria's case, the violence in her country, the threats, the real danger she and her son faced if they were deported. Then it was Maria's turn. With a trembling voice, she began to tell her story, from her humble childhood in Chiquimula, through the first signs of violence in her community, to the day when the threats became personal, when the cartel men left a message painted on her door: "We rule here. Obey or die." The judge listened in silence, taking notes from time to time. The government lawyer interrupted occasionally to ask tough questions, as if trying to find contradictions in her account. "Why didn't you go to the authorities in Guatemala?" he asked at one point. Maria swallowed. "Because they work with the same people who threaten us. There was no one to turn to." The judge looked at her a few seconds longer, then nodded, as if he understood. When she finished her testimony, Ana Belén presented the letters of support from Doña Marta, from her shelter companions, evidence of her employment, and certificates from her English classes. The government lawyer reviewed the documents, but didn't seem impressed. When it was his turn to argue, he insisted that the violent situation in Guatemala was generalized and did not constitute sufficient personal persecution to grant asylum. Maria felt the room spinning around her. Had she made all this effort for nothing? Would they send her back? The judge called for a 20-minute recess to review all the information. Maria left the room trembling, hugging Diego as if she wanted to meld with him. Ana Belén offered her water, but Maria couldn't drink anything. Her stomach was a knot of anguish. They sat in a waiting room where other families also awaited decisions that would change their lives forever. "Don't lose faith," Ana Belén told her quietly. "Your case is strong," but Maria knew that sometimes the truth wasn't enough, that sometimes not even being honest and brave was enough. Finally, a court officer approached to call them back. Maria felt her legs barely supporting her when she re-entered the hearing room. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipped through some papers, and then looked directly at her. After reviewing all the evidence and considering the credible testimony of the applicant, he said in a serious tone, "The court has decided to grant asylum." Maria didn't understand at first. It was as if the words floated in the air, disconnected from their meaning. Ana Belén looked at her and nodded with an emotional smile. "You did it, Maria," she whispered. Then, as if a dam inside her broke, Maria began to cry. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of pure and absolute exhaustion. She held Diego against her chest, kissing him over and over while tears wet her face. The judge barely smiled. "Good luck, Mrs. Lopez Castillo. Take care." Maria could barely articulate a "thank you," choked by tears. They left the room as if floating. Ana Belén hugged her tightly in the hallway. "Now you can breathe easy," she told her. Easy. That word resonated in her mind like an unknown echo. How long had it been since she had felt true tranquility? That night, at Casa Nueva Esperanza, Maria was received as a heroine. The other women hugged her, cried with her, celebrated her triumph as if it were their own. Because in that place, every small victory was a light in the midst of darkness. Doña Marta organized a small improvised dinner, tamales, rice, beans, simple food, but served with love. As she ate, surrounded by warm faces, Maria watched Diego sleep in his improvised cart and knew that it had all been worth it. The pain, the hunger, the fear, the loneliness. Each step, each sacrifice, each tear had brought her to this moment. Finally, she could start over. Finally, she could dream without fear. And as laughter filled the shelter that night, Maria Fernanda Lopez Castillo knew she had gained much more than a permit. She had reclaimed her life. Days passed and, for the first time in a long time, Maria Fernanda began to make plans. They weren't big dreams yet. They were small yearnings, as simple as finding stable work, a place of her own to live with Diego, and continuing to learn English so she wouldn't always depend on others. With the help of Doña Marta and Ana Belén, she got a job interview at a local laundry. The salary was minimal, but it was a fixed income. And above all, it was legal. The work permit granted to her as a provisional asylum seeker opened a door that many failed to cross. The first day at the laundry was hard. The manager, a serious man named Don Victor, looked at her with distrust at first, like someone who isn't sure how long a woman like her will last in such heavy work. But Maria, as always, decided to prove her worth in silence. From the first shift, she earned everyone's respect with her dedication. Meanwhile, at night, when Diego slept, Maria reviewed English notebooks donated by the shelter. She repeated words in a low voice, fighting against fatigue, correcting her pronunciation in front of the broken mirror in her shared room. Future, freedom, family. Words that now had a different weight in her life. One weekend, Doña Marta offered her something Maria would never have dared to ask for: the opportunity to rent a small room in a support house near the shelter where single mothers like her could start a new life with some independence. The place was modest, a room with peeling walls, an old stove, a shared bathroom, but it was hers. A space of her own where Diego could crawl freely, where they could dream without asking permission. Moving was a simple yet monumental act. Maria packed her few belongings in a cardboard box and, with the help of 2 companions from the shelter, moved her world to that small corner of hope. The first night in her new home, Maria prepared white rice in a borrowed pot. She sat Diego on a small mattress on the floor, and they ate together under the dim light of a bare bulb. She looked at her son, who played happily with a plastic spoon, and felt her heart bursting with love and gratitude. "We made it, my life," she whispered, caressing his head. "This is just the beginning." As the weeks passed, Maria established a routine that filled her days with purpose. She worked at the laundry Monday through Saturday, attended English classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and on Sundays cooked for other mothers at the shelter as a thank you. Diego grew healthy and strong, surrounded by love. He learned to take his first steps in the narrow hallways of the support house, drawing laughter from the other women who saw in him a living symbol of resistance and hope. But life, as Maria knew well, is rarely completely fair. One afternoon, leaving work, she found an official envelope from the immigration department in her mailbox. Her heart immediately accelerated. Trembling, she opened the envelope right there under the burning sun of the parking lot. It was a notification that her asylum case would be re-examined by a new court in 3 months. It wasn't an immediate revocation, but it was a warning. Her status still wasn't completely permanent. Insecurity settled back in her chest like a dagger. The tranquility she had just begun to build was wobbling again. She ran to the house, hugged Diego tightly, and called Ana Belén. "Calm down," the lawyer told her in a firm tone. "This happens sometimes. We're going to defend your case." "You're not alone." Maria took a deep breath, clinging to those words. "You're not alone." She had spent so much time fighting alone that hearing that gave her back part of the strength she thought she had lost. She decided she wouldn't let herself be defeated. Not this time. She met with Ana Belén several times during the following weeks, preparing new documents, collecting letters of recommendation from her employer, from the English teachers, even from Doña Marta. Every night, after putting Diego to bed, she sat at her small table, reviewed papers, wrote summaries of her life, perfected her testimony. Each line written was a declaration of war against fear. And in the midst of this whirlwind of responsibilities and nervousness, something beautiful began to bloom, a sincere friendship with other mothers in similar situations. They shared advice, jokes, food, tears. One of them, Rosa, proposed something that at first seemed crazy to her. "Why don't we apply together for study scholarships?" she said one afternoon while folding clothes in the yard. "We can't stay like this forever." Maria smiled, doubtful. "Do you think they'll accept us?" "Why not? We've come this far, haven't we?" The idea seemed as absurd as it was wonderful. Study, learn, be something more than a survivor. That night, she searched online for support programs for migrants. She found one that offered partial scholarships for nursing assistant courses. Her heart was racing. Could she dare to dream so high? She thought of Diego, of his laughter, of his future. Yes, she could. That night, she filled out the online application with the clumsy English she barely managed, but with absolute conviction. She sent the form, and for the first time in months, slept deeply, hugging her son. Because even if threats returned, even if the path was uncertain, there was something that no one could take away from her: her right to dream. The days after submitting the scholarship application were filled with anxious expectation. Maria Fernanda continued working at the laundry and attending her English classes, but every time she checked her email, she felt her heart pounding in her ears. She knew she couldn't put all her hopes in a single opportunity, but she couldn't help it. Studying meant much more than improving her living conditions. It was the door to a future where she and Diego wouldn't have to keep running from poverty or humiliation. On a hot Friday afternoon, while hanging clothes in the small backyard of the support house, she heard the sound of her cell phone vibrating inside. She ran to pick it up, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a new email. With trembling hands, she opened the message. "Congratulations, Maria Fernanda Lopez Castillo. Your application has been accepted. We grant you a partial scholarship for the nursing assistant program. Immediate start." For a second, she thought she had misread. She blinked several times, reviewing each word, until the emotion exploded inside her chest. She let out a muffled cry, covering her mouth with her hand, and tears flowed uncontrollably. Diego, startled by her reaction, crawled toward her with an innocent smile. Maria lifted him in her arms, spinning with him in the small space of her room, laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it, my love," she whispered between sobs. "We did it." She ran to call Doña Marta, who arrived shortly after, panting from the rush. When Maria showed her the email, the woman hugged her with maternal strength. "I knew you were special, daughter," she said with bright eyes. "This is just the beginning." Maria knew she would have to keep working to cover what the scholarship didn't pay: books, transportation, materials, but she didn't care. She would manage, as she always had. Classes began the following week. The community center where she would study was more than an hour away by bus, which meant getting up even earlier and coordinating with the shelter's daycare to leave Diego. Each morning was a race against the clock, preparing him, packing his food, ensuring he arrived clean and warm, and then running to not miss the transportation. The first day of classes, Maria arrived sweating, with her shirt sticking to her back and her hair disheveled. She sat at the back of the classroom, nervous, surrounded by much younger and more confident students. The instructor, a woman with a kind smile named Mrs. Hernandez, looked at her and gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Welcome," she said. "Today you begin a new life." Maria squeezed the notebook between her hands. A new life. That phrase had an immense weight for her. At first, the classes were overwhelming. Anatomy, medical terminology, first aid, all in English. Each term seemed like an impossible mountain to climb, but every time she thought of giving up, she remembered Diego's face. And then she found strength where she thought there was none left. Little by little, word by word, exercise after exercise, she began to understand, to master concepts, to feel part of the classroom. During a first aid practice, Mrs. Hernandez approached her. "You have good hands, Maria," she told her. "You have a natural instinct for caring." Maria smiled, shy, but inside her heart swelled with pride. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could be someone more than a survivor. The routine was exhausting. Work in the mornings, classes in the afternoon, caring for Diego at night. She barely slept 4 or 5 hours a day. But the satisfaction of moving forward, of building something real, kept her going. At the shelter, her companions began to see her with different eyes, not as the shy girl who had arrived trembling, but as an example of struggle and hope. Rosa, her closest friend, encouraged her every time she saw her crumbling from exhaustion. "Come on, Maria," she would say between laughs. "You already survived the desert. This can't be worse." And she was right. Nothing could be as hard as that night under the cold stars, giving birth alone in the middle of nowhere. 2 months after starting the course, Maria received another important email. The laundry where she worked offered to slightly increase her salary if she accepted extra hours on weekends. She didn't hesitate. She immediately accepted. Every dollar counted. Every sacrifice was for Diego. Each night, after everything, she sat on the floor of her small room, with Diego asleep on her leg, reviewing notes, writing summaries, preparing for exams. Sometimes, the fatigue was so brutal that she felt the world spinning around her, but she never thought of giving up. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning at the laundry, she received an unexpected call. It was Ana Belén. "Maria," said the voice on the other end. "I have news." Maria dried her hands on her apron, her heart racing. "What happened?" "Your permanent residency has been approved. You're going to receive your green card." Maria dropped the cloth she had in her hand. She brought the other to her mouth, in a gesture of disbelief. "Really?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Really? You are now a legal resident, Maria. You and your son." Tears immediately welled up. This time they weren't tears of pain, but of a happiness so pure it hurt her chest. After so many dusty roads, hunger, threats, and sleepless nights, life finally offered her something she had learned not to expect: a real opportunity, a home, a future. And as she ran back to the shelter to hug Diego and tell him, though he still couldn't understand, Maria knew with every fiber of her being that it had all been worth it, because finally, after so much darkness, the light had come to stay. And if you like this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. Until next time.